The ballroom was gold and glass that night, chandeliers throwing light across 200 people in black tie, string quartet tucked into a corner playing something nobody was really listening to, and I was standing beside my husband holding a glass of champagne I hadn't taken a sip from yet, when his new vice president reached out to shake my hand and asked how long Julian and I had been roommates. I remember the exact weight of my wedding ring against my finger in that moment, because I had been turning it with my thumb out of habit, the way I always did at events like this, a small anchoring motion nobody ever noticed. Julian answered before I could. "About 2 years," he said, smiling easily, the same smile he used in client meetings. "We split a place downtown. Great location, terrible parking." The vice president laughed. Somewhere behind them, a woman I didn't recognize glanced at my hand, at the ring catching the chandelier light, and then looked away quickly, the way you look away from something you weren't supposed to notice either. I smiled. I said something pleasant about the building's architecture, something about the restored ceiling moldings, the kind of harmless observation that gives a conversation somewhere else to go. I did not correct him. I did not pull my hand back or raise my voice or ask him, in front of his entire leadership team, why his wife of 5 years had just been demoted to a rental agreement. I finished my champagne, excused myself to find the restroom, reapplied my lipstick in a mirror under lighting that made everyone look slightly guilty, and walked back into that ballroom, exactly as composed as I'd left it. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just started paying very close attention to everything that happened for the rest of that night. Who Julian introduced me to, who he didn't, and which version of our life he handed to each of them. My name is Simone Hale. I was 34 that winter, a trusts and estates attorney at a small firm downtown, the kind of lawyer families call when someone dies and the paperwork doesn't match what everyone was promised out loud. My job trained me to read the difference between what people say a document means and what the document actually says, and after 11 years of probate disputes, I had learned that the gap between those two things is where almost every family secret eventually hides. I have sat across from grieving widows who discovered, weeks after a funeral, that they had been quietly removed from a policy years earlier and never told. I had always assumed that particular kind of blindness happened to other people, people less careful than I was. I believed, walking into that ballroom, that I understood my own marriage at least as well as I understood a stranger's estate file. I was wrong about that in ways I wouldn't fully understand for another 2 months. I met Julian Ashford 9 years ago at a mutual friend's wedding, both of us seated at the same overflow table, both of us making the same joke about overflow tables to break the ice. He was warm in a way that felt effortless, ambitious in a way that felt admirable, rather than exhausting, and for the first 4 years of knowing him, I never once doubted that ambition included me in it. We married 5 years ago in a small ceremony his mother cried through twice, and I remember thinking, standing at the altar, that I had found the rare kind of driven man who didn't need you to shrink so he could feel tall. Around the same time, Julian took a director role at a fast-growing fintech company called Verint, one built by a young, intense founder named Aldous Price, who had a reputation, half rumor and half fact, for favoring executives who seemed fully consumed by the company, unattached, unencumbered, endlessly available, the kind of people who answered emails at midnight without anyone needing to ask them to. I didn't think much of that reputation at the time. I filed it away the way you file away office gossip that doesn't seem to apply to you. The first 2 years of Julian's time at Verint went the way most demanding jobs do. Long hours, late dinners eaten separately, weekends that occasionally disappeared into a launch deadline. I didn't resent it. I had my own long hours, my own launch deadlines dressed up as probate filings, and there is a particular understanding that develops between two ambitious people who both know exactly what it costs to build something, an understanding that doesn't need constant explaining. What I didn't notice, not for a long time, was how carefully our life together had started shrinking down to a size that fit inside a single, uncomplicated sentence whenever Julian was asked about himself at work. He stopped mentioning me by name in casual conversation with new colleagues, referring instead to someone at home or my place, small substitutions I noticed individually and never once added together. I assumed that sentence was simply efficient, a habit picked up from an industry that prizes brevity above almost everything else. I didn't yet know it was a strategy, built one careful omission at a time, each one small enough that objecting to it alone would have made me look unreasonable. There was a stretch, about 3 years into his time at Verint, when Julian came home unusually quiet for several weeks in a row, the kind of quiet that used to worry me before I learned to read it as ordinary work stress. I asked him about it more than once. He told me it was nothing, a difficult client, a board meeting that hadn't gone well. I believed him, the way you believe someone you've built 9 years of trust with, because doubting him at that point would have required a kind of vigilance I didn't yet know I needed. Looking back, I understand now that this was almost certainly the period when his father's diagnosis first reached him, and when whatever fear drove the choices that followed first started taking shape, quietly, without me anywhere inside the conversation. Renata Voss ran HR at Verint, and she became, over those 5 years, one of the people I trusted most outside my own firm. She remembered my birthday. She sent Julian home early on our anniversary 2 years running, quietly rearranging his calendar without being asked. She used to tell me, at company holiday parties, how lucky Julian was to have someone as grounded as me. How rare that was in an industry that ate grounded people alive. Once, at a summer barbecue at her house, she pulled me aside near the drinks table and told me, half joking, that I should never let anyone at Verint convince me my marriage was something to keep quiet about, that she'd seen good people talked into smaller and smaller versions of their own lives before. At the time, I thought it was a strange, oddly specific thing to say. I laughed it off. I liked Renata enormously. I want to say that clearly before I tell you what she was actually doing, because admiration and envy wear the same face, and Renata had spent years wearing both without my noticing which one I was looking at on any given day. The night of the gala, I did not confront Julian when we got home. I have a professional rule that I apply to every estate dispute I've ever worked, and without quite deciding to, I had started applying it to my own marriage as well. Gather everything before they know you've seen it. A confrontation without documentation is just an accusation, and accusations get explained away by morning. So I told Julian I was tired, and once his breathing evened out beside me, I got up, went to the small office we kept off our bedroom, and opened the shared cloud drive we'd used for years to manage our finances together. I wasn't looking for anything specific at first. I told myself I was checking our joint statements the way you check a smoke detector after a bad dream, mostly for reassurance. What I found instead, 40 minutes in, was a beneficiary change form filed with Verint's HR department 8 months earlier, removing me as the named beneficiary on Julian's employee stock plan and company life insurance policy, and replacing me with a name I didn't recognize. My hands were steady while I read it, in the same way they're steady when I read a will that doesn't say what a grieving family expected it to say, a professional stillness that has nothing to do with how much it actually costs you internally. Underneath it, in the same folder, sat a company relationship disclosure form, the kind most firms require executives to file, listing Julian's marital status as single. I closed the laptop that first night around 2 in the morning and sat in the dark office for a while, listening to Julian breathing evenly through the wall, completely unaware that the marriage he thought he'd been quietly managing had already shifted into something else entirely without him in the room for it. There's no drama in that particular moment, no matter what people expect. There's just a very quiet click somewhere behind your ribs, and then the actual work begins. I spent the next 3 weeks the way I spend the opening weeks of any contested estate, quietly, methodically, without alerting anyone that I had already started building a file. I pulled the beneficiary paperwork's full history and found it had been amended twice, each time shortly after a promotion cycle at Verint. I cross-referenced dates against Julian's calendar and travel and found the name on the new beneficiary form belonged to a woman named Colette Marchetti, listed in Verint's internal directory as a project consultant based in Denver, someone Julian had mentioned exactly once, in passing, 18 months earlier, over a dinner where I remembered being more focused on a filing deadline of my own than on the name of one of his colleagues. I searched my own calendar from that period, cross-referencing it against a handful of trips Julian had taken to Denver that he'd described at the time as investor meetings, and found that 3 of the 4 trips lined up with billing dates on Colette's contract almost exactly, a level of precision that told me this was not a casual acquaintance handled loosely. It was something scheduled with care. People who believe they will never be found out leave the messiest trails, because the effort of staying careful is exhausting to sustain, and Julian, I discovered, had stopped being careful with the file names on his own cloud folder months ago. Half of them still carried their original, unedited titles, the digital equivalent of leaving a drawer half open. But 4 days into pulling records on Colette Marchetti, I found something that didn't fit the affair I thought I was building a case around. Her consulting contract, filed with Verint's Accounts Payable Department, was for elder care logistics services, not project work, and it was billed against an entirely separate cost center that didn't belong to any department at the company at all. I sat with that discrepancy for a long time, the way I sit with any file that stops making sense halfway through, because a story that no longer fits its own evidence usually means you haven't found the real story yet. The deeper twist came from Renata herself, 3 weeks later, sitting across from me in my own kitchen, her hands wrapped tightly around a coffee mug she never drank from. She told me that Colette Marchetti wasn't Julian's mistress. She was a caregiver, hired 18 months earlier to manage the medical needs of Julian's estranged father, a man Julian hadn't spoken of to me in the entire 5 years of our marriage because the two of them had been estranged since before we met, and because Julian, apparently, believed that admitting his father was dying of a slow, expensive illness would make him look exactly like the kind of encumbered, distracted executive Aldous Price had a documented habit of quietly sidelining. Renata said she knew, because 11 years earlier, before I ever met either of them, she had been passed over for a promotion at Verint herself. In the same quarter, Aldous Price learned she was pregnant and married to a man at a competing firm. Nobody had said the word discrimination out loud. Nobody had needed to. She had simply watched the promotion go to someone else, quietly, the paperwork clean the entire way through. She said that when Julian confided in her about his father, terrified of what visibility might cost him, she had told him exactly what she wished someone had warned her. Present single, present unencumbered, keep the personal completely separate from the professional record, never imagining, she said, that he would take that advice all the way into erasing his own wife on a legal form. She told me about her own experience in more detail than she ever had before, how she'd found out about the missed promotion secondhand, through a colleague's careless comment in a hallway, how she'd spent months afterward wondering what she could have done differently, only to eventually learn, years later, that nothing she could have done would have mattered, because the decision had been made the moment Aldous Price learned she was building a family instead of only building his company. She said she had watched Julian do the same slow erasing in small stages, first at conferences, then in casual conversation, and each time she'd told herself it wasn't her place to stop giving advice she still half believed was protecting him, right up until the night at the gala, when she'd watched me shake that vice president's hand and finally understood exactly how far the small stages had gone. I called an old law school classmate who now worked in employment litigation to independently confirm what Renata had described, mostly out of habit, because verification is not something I know how to switch off, in a marriage or anywhere else. She pulled Verint's disclosure policy and walked me through it clause by clause over the phone, confirming that yes, a false marital status filing tied to benefits and stock allocation could constitute real exposure for both Julian and the company if it were ever formally challenged. She also mentioned, almost as an aside, that she'd seen 2 similar cases at other fintech firms in the past 5 years, both involving executives quietly editing their own personal records to fit a founder's unofficial preferences, which told me this wasn't some strange, isolated fear unique to Julian. It was a pattern the industry had quietly normalized long before it ever reached our kitchen table. Which told me, more than anything, that the beneficiary change hadn't been a small, sentimental oversight. It had been deliberate, legally significant, and quietly built to survive scrutiny. The blame I had started, in the first days, to quietly assign myself, that I had somehow made myself easy to hide, easy to fold into a rental agreement in front of a room full of strangers, wasn't mine to carry. It had been built, carefully, out of Julian's fear and Renata's own unhealed history, long before I ever walked into that ballroom. The reveal happened at Verint's next quarterly town hall, in front of nearly the entire leadership team, in the same auditorium where Julian had once told me his promotion announcement would be made, back when he still described his career to me in detail, instead of in careful summary. I heard about it afterward from my friend Priya, who worked 2 floors below Julian, and had gone purely for the free breakfast. Renata, Priya told me, stood up during the open comment period, unprompted, and said she needed to correct the record on something she had personally advised an employee to do years ago that she now believed had caused real harm. She didn't name Julian directly at first, but by the second sentence, half the room had already turned to look at him. Priya said Julian's face went completely still, the particular stillness of someone doing rapid math on how much damage was currently unfolding in real time. A woman 2 rows behind him, Priya said, actually took out her phone to type a note to herself before catching herself and putting it away. Aldous Price, seated at the front, reportedly said nothing at all for nearly a full minute, which Priya said was somehow louder than if he'd shouted, and when he finally spoke it was only to ask Renata, evenly, to see him afterward. A sentence that told the entire room everything it needed to know, without confirming a single detail out loud. Priya said the meeting resumed a few minutes later as though nothing had happened, quarterly numbers projected back up on the screen, but that nobody in that auditorium was looking at the slides anymore. She said Julian left before the closing remarks, and that 2 of his own directors watched him go without saying a word to each other, the kind of silence that tells you an entire team has already, quietly, started recalculating who they trust. I met Julian 2 nights later, at our apartment, on my own schedule, the beneficiary paperwork already photocopied, and sitting in a folder in my car, the way I always keep a clean copy of anything that matters before a difficult conversation. He tried to explain it the way people always explain things they've had weeks to quietly rehearse. starting with the part that made him sound the most sympathetic, saving the actual admission for somewhere near the middle, hoping the shape of the story would carry more weight than the individual facts inside it. He said he'd been terrified, that his father's illness had felt like a liability he couldn't afford to be seen carrying, that Renata's advice had made sense in a moment when nothing else did, that he loved me and had never meant for the lie to touch the actual paperwork of our marriage. He told me he'd meant to fix the disclosure form a dozen times, that he kept telling himself he'd correct it after the next round of funding closed, after the next promotion cycle passed, after just one more quarter of feeling steady enough to survive being seen as anything less than singularly devoted to the company. He said the lie had started small enough that he genuinely couldn't remember the exact day it stopped being a temporary precaution and became simply how things were. I let him finish every word of it. Then I told him I understood exactly where the fear had come from now, and that understanding where a lie comes from does not obligate you to keep living inside it. I can see why you did it, I said. That's different from forgiving it. And it's very different from staying married to it. He asked what that meant. I told him it meant I had already had the beneficiary forms and the disclosure filing reviewed by outside counsel the week I found them, before I ever heard Renata's name attached to any of it, because some decisions don't need the full story to become final. They only need enough of it. He reached for my hand once, near the end of that conversation, the same reflexive gesture I imagine he'd used 100 times before, to smooth over smaller disagreements, and I let it rest there for a moment, before drawing mine back gently, not out of anger, but because I finally understood the difference between comfort and resolution, and I was done confusing the two for his benefit. The separation took 4 months and stayed clean, because I insisted on that myself, treating our own finances with the same detachment I bring to any client's estate. I didn't ask for more than what was legally mine. I didn't need to punish him through a settlement. The corrected paperwork had already done the more honest work of that on its own. I did, however, insist on one thing that had nothing to do with money at all: that Julian personally correct the disclosure form with Varant's HR department himself, in writing, rather than let it quietly lapse the way convenient lies so often do. He agreed without arguing. I think some part of him understood, by then, that it was the smallest possible price for what the lie had actually cost. He asked once, near the end, sitting across a mediation table, whether there was any version of this where we tried again. I told him no. The way you close a probate file, you've finally finished reconciling. Quietly, without needing to reread the earlier pages, to already know how the estate settles. He nodded, and for a moment he looked less like the man who had introduced me as his roommate, and more like the 26-year-old I'd met at that overflow table years earlier, before either of us had learned how much of ourselves we might eventually be willing to trade for the appearance of being unstoppable. It didn't change my answer. It just made the answer feel, briefly, sadder to give. It has been just over a year now. I left my old firm to open a small practice of my own, one that focuses specifically on beneficiary disputes and hidden estate filings. The quiet paperwork corners where people discover, usually far too late, that someone rewrote a piece of their life without telling them. Last month, a new client sat across my desk, a woman in her 40s, and told me she'd found out at her own husband's retirement dinner that colleagues of 30 years had never once heard he was married. I recognized the particular stillness in her voice before she'd finished the sentence, the same careful, overcomposed calm I remember using myself in a mirror under bad lighting. I told her the same thing I wish someone had told me in that ballroom, that being erased on paper by someone who claims to love you is never the small, forgivable thing it's dressed up to be, and that the paperwork almost always knows the truth before the rest of the family is willing to say it out loud. She hired me on the spot, and we spent the next hour going through 11 years of beneficiary filings together, page by page, the way I now do with every client who walks through my door, carrying that same particular stillness. I still hear from Renata occasionally. She sent flowers the week my practice opened, no card attached, and I understood exactly what they meant without one. Julian's father passed away 7 months ago. Colette Marchetti sent me a short, kind email about it, unprompted, and I sat with that longer than I expected to. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't making someone suffer for what they hid from you. It's simply refusing to stay quietly filed under a title you never agreed to. If you'd been standing beside me in that ballroom the night he called me his roommate, I want to know honestly, would you have smiled through it too, or walked out right then? Tell me in the comments where you're watching this from tonight, and if you want more stories like Simone's, stay close and hit subscribe, because this is only one of many.